Good morning, everyone. For those of us who are atheists, and for those of you who've listened to me send out the warning cry about the Supreme Court for over 20 years now, unfortunately, we have great challenges against us. We have two things we have to do. We have to fight legally to preserve the separation of church and state and the equality of non-believers. And then, unique to the role of the Center for Inquiry, we have to fight intellectually to demonstrate, not by coercion, but by argument, why we are right about atheism. And so it's a great privilege for me at this very, very difficult time for atheists and secular people to introduce today's speaker. Jack Wathey, John C. Wathey, has a PhD in neuroscience from the University of California at San Diego. From 1991 to 1995, he was a senior applications scientist at Biosym Technologies, a company that develops molecular modeling software and for the pharmaceutical company. In '96, he founded his own business, Wathey Research. And since that time, most of his scientific research has been funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health. He is also very skilled in research dealing with the biology of nervous systems. And the book that he will be discussing today that we have for sale is crucial to what we secular humanists must do in society at large as we attempt to persuade our brother and sister human beings that God's presence is indeed an illusion. Please welcome Dr. Wathey.
Thank you, Eddie, for that kind introduction. I'd also like to extend my special thanks to our mutual friend Darrell Ray, who introduced me to you a month ago. It's truly a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you today. My title, The Illusion of God's Presence, refers to something important about religion that I think science has mostly overlooked, and that's what we'll be exploring today. My talk will be in 4 parts. In part 1, I'll spend a few minutes talking about where I'm coming from and why I wrote the book, and I'll discuss a strange puzzle that has to do with the religiousness of some elite scientists. In part 2, we'll take a look at visual illusions and visual perception. And some of you may wonder what this has to do with religion, but be patient. I think you'll see the relevance when we get to part 3, where I try to explain the feeling of God's presence as an illusion. In this part of the talk, I'll try to show you how this is similar to and different from the visual illusions, and I'll try to also to explain why we are vulnerable to this illusion. I have a hypothesis about that, and it makes some testable predictions. So we'll be taking a look at behavioral biology and some evidence from neuroscience in this part of the talk. This will be most of the talk, part 3. Is it too closer? Okay. How's that? Is that okay? Okay. And finally, in part 4, I'll return to that puzzle that I mentioned in part 1, having to do with why some of our most brilliant scientists believe in God. So that's the map of where we're going. Let's go on to part 1. Where am I coming from? Like Eddie said, I got my PhD in the Department of Neurosciences at UCSD with Ted Bullock, shown here on the left. That's a much younger me on the right, celebrating my dissertation defense. Ted is widely regarded as the father of neuroethology, and ethology, as you probably know, is the study of animal behavior in its natural context. Ethologists are mostly interested in how a behavior contributes to an animal's reproductive success and the evolutionary history of a behavior. neuroethology is a little different, a little more specific than that. The central idea in neuroethology is that if we're trying to understand how a part of the brain works, we must first understand the problem it's trying to solve. And the best way to do that is to find animals that are highly specialized for a single, well-understood, and easily measured behavior. For example, things like infrared vision in rattlesnakes, the electric sense in weakly electric fish, and song learning in birds, which turns out to be a remarkably useful animal model for understanding language acquisition in humans. My years with TED really had a profound effect on how I understand living things, including humans. And it was during this time that I first started to see religion through the lens of neuroethology. I felt there was something about religion that science needed to pay more attention to, or that something that was being ignored. And I even had fantasies back then of writing a book about it someday. But it would be many, many years later that I actually sat down to start writing the book. And one of the things that prodded me to start working on it was a talk that I heard by Neil deGrasse Tyson. There is something else going on that nobody seems to be talking about. That's how Neil put it when he was referring to this same scientific blind spot. He was referring to something mysterious and alluring about religion that can seduce even the most brilliant of scientific minds. To make his case, he referred to some data from a paper in Nature in 1998. And the point of the paper was that if you look at the general American public back in the late 1990s, roughly 90% of people say they believe in a God who answers prayer. If you look at American scientists, however, that turns out to be much lower, about 40% averaged across disciplines. But if you look at elite scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, 93% of them reject belief in a personal God. That was the point of the paper. But Neil's point was that these authors had missed the most fascinating and exciting and puzzling thing in their data, namely, why isn't this number 0? Religious belief drops off with increasing scientific training, but it reaches a non-zero asymptote. So why is this? This is a deep puzzle that nobody seems to be talking about. And in addition to making that point, Neil also said that if we really want to understand religion, these are the people we should be studying, not the general public. Because whatever it is that can make believers out of these folks must be the most concentrated essence of the thing we're trying to understand. So today I will try to answer Neil's challenge. I'll try to explain this non-zero asymptote, and I'll be taking a look at one particular member of this group down here, this puzzling 7%. But before we get into that, we need some information or some insights from visual illusions. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality. In the Ames room illusions shown here, the brain has a neural model of rectangular rooms with horizontal floors and parallel walls. And that's why we see the identical twins as grossly different in size, because the brain has this model, these assumptions that it's making about the shape of the room. Now, if you look into this room with both eyes, the illusion instantly vanishes, because then your depth perception will reveal the true shape of the room, which is not rectangular. But as long as you look with only one eye, you see the illusion. Even if you completely understand how it works, even if you built the room with your own 2 hands, this is what psychologists call cognitive impenetrability, or conscious understanding of the reality of the situation is not enough to penetrate the illusion. Now, here's another interesting visual challenge. Is this thing a meaningful image or a random blob? And I'd actually like to get your input on this. If you see anything meaningful in this image, Just tell me what you see, or raise your hand if you want to vote for random blob. Do you see anything? I see a lot of hands going up for random blob, so it's kind of hard to see anything in that. I'll make it a little easier for you. Does anybody see anything now? Okay, anybody see a face in that? Okay, good. And can you tell me what gender the face is? Woman. Okay, good. Everybody's. Is anybody having trouble seeing a face in this? Okay, good. This is one of the most difficult puzzles of this kind. I'll try to give you some hints. It's a woman's face looking directly at you. The light is coming that direction. This is her right eye. Her left eye would be here, but it's washed out by the light. Here's her nose. Here's her mouth. Here's her chin. So the face is about like that. So does everybody pretty much see the face now? We have a few people who are having trouble still. So here's an eye, here's her other eye, here's her nose, here's her lips, there's the chin. That's her hair there, curled up a little bit. This thing is called a Mooney face, after psychologist Craig Mooney, who started studying visual perception with these images back in the 1950s. And this is one of the hardest ones that he came up with, and it's especially hard upside down. But now that you've seen the face, now that you've found the face in it, or at least I hope most of you have, do you think you'd be able to see the face if I turned it upside down again? Yeah, you're ahead of most people. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, I can probably see this upside down. You might think you could just concentrate on where the individual features are, which you know. But most people who know where the face is, when it's upside down, they lose the face percept. And I'm one of those. I can tell where the things are that I'm supposed to be seeing as a face, but it just doesn't look like a face to me anymore. There are two important lessons here. One is that this is another example of cognitive impenetrability. We know consciously that there is a face in this image, and we even know where the eye and the mouth and the nose are, but we lose the conscious percept of the face, the vivid percept of the face that we had when it was right side up. So we have some kind of neural model in the brain of what a face looks like, but it's failing us for some reason here when the face is upside down. But if we turn the face right side up, then we get this vivid percept of a face snapping out of the image at us. And that's lesson number 2. Perception comes not only from sensory input, which is very sparse here, very impoverished, but also from what the brain expects. This is a very impoverished image. These Mooney faces are stripped of all color, shades of gray, spatial detail. But our neural model of what a face is fills in a lot of that stuff and gives us the impression of a face. Here's another illusion. Don't say anything if you've seen this. I'm curious if anybody has not seen this illusion. Raise your hand if you've never seen this and don't know what it's about. Okay, that's great. We have some people who have not seen this. Can you tell me who this is? Do you recognize the person? Margaret. Okay, good, very good. This is Margaret Thatcher. One of the first things you'll notice about this is that the two images look very similar. And at first glance, if I'd only flashed it for half a second, you might think they were identical. But if you look carefully, you'll see some differences. There are differences in the eyes, and there's some differences in the mouth. But other than that, they pretty much look the same, and they sort of give you the same impression. Okay, that is the illusion. You're seeing the illusion right now. The illusion is that these two are fairly similar. They are not similar. And I'll show you now what they really look like. On the left, she's a hideous ghoul. And because this was first inflicted on poor Margaret Thatcher, she has the honor of having the illusion named after her. I doubt she appreciated it at the time. What this tells us is that there's a special purpose circuit in the brain for the holistic processing of upright faces. And our sense of the normality of the face and the emotional impact of a face, those things are utterly dependent on that circuit. If we see the face upside down, then we can't use that circuit, and we are utterly blind to the ghoulishness of Margaret Thatcher in this image over here. But one thing this image cannot tell us is this circuit innate? It could be that the brain is lousy at making sense of upside-down faces because we almost never see upside-down faces. Maybe we just haven't had enough experience looking at upside-down faces. So is this thing innate or learned? Well, there is a way to find out. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception. Identical twins share about 100%, or exactly 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins share about 50% of their genes. So if identical twins are significantly more alike in their face perception ability than are pairs of fraternal twins, that's compelling evidence for a genetic effect in face perception. Unfortunately, we can't use the Thatcher illusion for this because there's no easy way to quantify your subjective impression of ghoulishness. We need numbers to do a twin study. So we need to turn to some other measures of holistic face perception. And luckily, there are some that give us numbers. I'll just briefly show you three. I won't go into much detail on how these work. But the first one is a simple memory test. People are much better at remembering images of faces than they are at remembering images of houses. The other two tests here are both, the task in both of those tests is to look for very subtle differences between pairs of faces. And in this one in the middle, in the control condition, they break holistic processing of the upright face by just turning the faces upside down. And in this other one, they break holistic face processing by splitting the face and shifting the lower half horizontally like that. So those are three nice, robust tests of holistic face perception that give us numbers. And the twin study has been done, and it found a strong genetic contribution to holistic face perception. About a third of the variance in face perception ability across individuals comes from genetic factors, a little more than a third for the faces versus houses, and a little less for the other two tests. We even know where in the brain this circuit lies, because if a stroke victim suffers damage to the fusiform gyrus, which is shown in red here on the underside of the temporal lobes, the result is a syndrome of profound face blindness called prosopagnosia. And you don't even need to damage the entire fusiform gyrus. If you just damage the parts shown in red here, these two little spots called the fusiform face area, that's enough to cause this face blindness syndrome. Now, it's a little misleading to call it face blindness, because if you show a photograph of a face to one of these patients, they can still tell you that they see a face, and they can point out the eyes and the nose and all of that stuff. But what they cannot do is tell you whose face it is, even if it's a famous person, even if it's a photograph of one of their close family members. Also, this deficit is permanent. No other part of the brain can learn to take over this function if you damage those two little red spots. Interestingly, this effect of the deficit being permanent is most severe if the damage happens in a one-day-old infant. This paper I'm citing down at the bottom here refers to a study of a teenager who, as an infant, suffered a stroke that destroyed the fusiform face area at 1 day of age. Now, he went on to have permanent and profound face blindness, but his recognition of non-face objects was more or less normal. It was a bit impaired, but much less than the effect on the face perception. And that's typical of this face blindness syndrome. What's astonishing about this is that this age, at infancy, this is the time when the brain is most plastic. This is the time when local damage to the brain it's when you have the best chance of having some other part of the brain take over that function. If you lose the entire left hemisphere, the language dominant hemisphere in a young child, the right hemisphere will learn to take over language, and you'll have fairly normal language. But you damage those two little red spots and you utterly lose this holistic face perception. So what that says to us is that the fusiform face area is an extremely brittle, single-purpose, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute, despite the fact that this thing is a learning machine. The whole purpose of this thing is to learn to recognize thousands of individual faces over the course of a human lifetime. So it's not like there's no synaptic plasticity going on in here. There's lots of learning happening in here. That's what it's for. But it's a specialized kind of learning. Highly specialized learning of this kind requires a foundation of innate knowledge. It also raises an interesting question. If there is this innate aspect to holistic face perception, can a newborn infant use any of this innate knowledge about faces? Well, that's something we can actually test in the lab, and it turns out that newborn infants do have some holistic face perception ability. They prefer to look at an upright Mooney face. They'll spend more time looking at an upright Mooney face than the upside down version of the same thing. They also prefer to look at a Mooney face relative to a similar non-face image. And because of a clever habituation test, we know that newborn infants see these two images as the same, but they see these two as different. So I would like to now summarize the main points thus far. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. The brain takes shortcuts in its internal models to improve performance at critical perceptual tasks, like, for example, the assumption that faces are going to be upright. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality, and the shortcuts in the neural model may be the kind of thing that makes it differ from reality in special circumstances. Learning often requires a foundation of innate knowledge, and we saw an example of that in the fusiform face area. And twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception and behavior. So now we're in a position to tackle this illusion of God's presence. What exactly is this? How does it differ from these other visual illusions we've been looking at? How is it similar? How does it affect religious belief? Why are we vulnerable to it? When I start trying to answer these kinds of questions with ideas from biology and evolution, I sometimes get the objection that, well, religion is a cultural thing. It comes from learning and indoctrination, so your biological ideas must be mistaken. Let's get this out of the way first. There are two lines of evidence that religion is partly a biological thing. One comes from anthropology. It's the observation that religion is a cultural universal. And the other comes from our gold standard for answering questions like this, the twin studies. They show that religiousness is significantly heritable. Roughly half of the variance in religiousness across individuals comes from genetic factors. Identical twins are more alike in their religiousness than are fraternal twins. And before I start talking about the part of religion that science has overlooked, I should say a little bit about what science has concentrated on. And in my book, I lump those things together under what I call the social root of religion. These are the aspects of religion that have something to do with human social behavior. So from this kind of religiousness, we get belief in judgmental, punishing gods. We get stronger cooperation with members of our in-group. We get greater hostility towards members of competing outgroups. And we get rituals of sacrifice as proof of belief and loyalty. And finally, there are group rituals that get believers moving and feeling as one. So all of this stuff is important. But the God of unconditional love comes from someplace else. And memes like this one that propagate virally on social media strongly suggest that the biological origin of this God has something to do with human infancy. It's this infantile aspect of religion that I think science has mostly overlooked, and I think this is where the illusion of God's presence comes from. Many believers say they have felt God's presence. In a random sample in Great Britain, 38% of respondents said they have felt this feeling of God's presence at some time in their lives. And we get a similar phenomenon in people in extreme environments, mountaineers, polar explorers. They often describe the illusion of a sensed presence, although not always with a religious interpretation. So how can I make you see this illusion? Unfortunately, the short answer is I can't. In this painting here, the artist has depicted it in a visual way, and that's because that's what artists do. But it's really not a visual thing. Most people who have this feeling, this sensation, don't describe it in terms of a visual hallucination. So there's nothing analogous to a Mooney face or a Thatcher illusion that I could put up on the screen here and make you feel God's presence. One of my reviewers argues that I shouldn't even call it an illusion for exactly that reason. But I'm hoping to persuade you that illusion really is the right concept here. What distinguishes this from the other illusions we were looking at a minute ago is that this one does not happen in visual cortex like the others do. If my hypothesis is right, this feeling or illusion of God's presence is happening in higher level areas of the brain called association cortex. And these get sensory input from all sensory modalities. They're involved in generating complex behaviors. They're affected by all kinds of subtle things having to do with the internal state of the person, things like memories, emotion, motivation, intention. If I had some magical way of controlling all of those things in you in just the right way, I might be able to make you feel God's presence in the same way I can make you see the Thatcher illusion. But lacking that, the next best thing I can do is to just show you a few verbal descriptions of what this illusion is like from people who've experienced it. So I'll give you a few. They tend to come in two categories. One is that comes on gradually and lasts a long time, maybe even a lifetime. People who have this will sometimes describe it as the feeling that the universe is somehow mindful or benevolent, or that God is with them always and they feel God's love, or that God lives within them. Here's an example from blogger Andrew Sullivan. I have never doubted the existence of God, never. My acceptance of God's existence, of a force beyond everything and the source of everything, goes so far back in my consciousness and memory that I can neither recall finding this faith nor being taught it. It is the air I have always breathed. And then there's another kind that comes on suddenly and doesn't last very long. This kind of illusion often happens to people in some kind of emotional or physical crisis, maybe a moment of physical danger or a feeling of great utter helplessness. And I'll show you an example that comes from a database collected by marine biologist Alistair Hardy. He was a scientist who had felt this illusion himself and was so taken by it that he spent his later years collecting these from people. He ended up collecting thousands of reports of this kind. So here's just one of them. Then, just as I was exhausted and despairing, I had the most wonderful sense of the presence of God. He was in a particular place in the room, about 5 feet from me. I didn't look up, but kept my head in my hands and my eyes shut. It was a feeling of an all-embracing love which called forth every ounce of love I had in me. It was the tenderest love I have ever encountered, and my sins were blotted out completely. Notice especially the strong emotions in this and the spatial specificity of the illusion in a particular place at a specific distance. And finally, there's another aspect that I want to mention about these illusions, and that is that they tend to come with an intuitive feeling of knowing or sense of certainty. It's an intuition that you've just experienced something that is deeply true and real. And this feeling, this intuitive feeling of certainty is so strong that the people who have this illusion take it as evidence for God's existence, and whole books have been written on this subject. I'll show you just a short excerpt from one of them. This comes from philosopher Eric Rayton, and he writes, "If we experience in our lives a presence that feels at once personal and ineffably vast, as if we've come into the presence of an ultimate loving reality sustaining the world, well, why shouldn't we treat that as experiential evidence for a personal God?" Now, to me, this is tantamount to looking into the Ames room and saying, wow, this is great. Somebody's invented a magic room that makes people shrink and grow when they walk across it. I see it, so it must be real. Now, it may seem a little silly when I put it that way, but that really is the essence of Rayton's argument here. And he is in very distinguished company when he makes this argument, because Francis Collins, director of the NIH and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, makes essentially the same argument in this book, The Language of God. Now, Collins covers a lot of ground in this book, but in my judgment, his evidence for God's existence really boils down to only this one thing, his sense of God's presence. And here's a little bit of what he said about that in the book. Could it be that this longing for the sacred, a universal and puzzling aspect of human experience, may not be wish fulfillment, but rather a pointer towards something beyond us? Why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled? And then later in the book he reiterates, there is a glowing signpost within our hearts pointing toward a benevolent and loving presence. This is really just a plain old God of the gaps argument. We don't understand these feelings. Science can never explain this. Therefore, God did it. The problem with that is that it doesn't really explain anything. It makes no testable predictions. It suggests no new experiments. It's an intellectual dead end. Francis Collins is a great scientist whom I greatly admire, but in this book he's gone off the rails of the scientific method. And I would like to get us back on track. I think there's a completely natural explanation for the illusion of God's presence, one that has something to do with the peculiar constraints of human infancy. I think a newborn infant, the neonatal brain of a newborn infant, expects something godlike, but that something isn't God. And we can see a hint of what it might be expecting in the Moreau reflex. Now, those of you who have raised infants have probably seen this. It's an infantile reflex that's thought to be, it's a startle reflex, and it's thought to be a vestige from our primate ancestors who, as infants, had to cling to their mother's fur, and whenever they were jostled or startled, had to suddenly reflexively reach out and grab on tight. So I think you will agree that it bears a striking resemblance to Pentecostal prayer. This is one of many, many examples of what I call the infantile or neonatal root of religion. There's a strong streak of infantile stuff in religious ritual and belief and behavior and writings, and this is just one especially compelling example. This is the aspect of religion that I think science has mostly overlooked. I think this is the mysterious something else going on that Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about. And I think it's where we need to look to understand the illusion of God's presence. And I have a hypothesis for how that happens. And my hypothesis has 3 parts. Part 1 is that a newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. It's not a detailed image of a specific person. It's just a vague sense of the existence of some primordial savior out there somewhere. And here are the essential elements of the model as I conceive it. A newborn infant knows that its mother exists, that she knows how to help the infant, is able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Those are the big things, but there's more to it than that. There's also some physiologically critical information about the mother providing nourishment through nipples that can be recognized by scent and touch and taste, about her having a melodic voice of feminine pitch, and about her having a face and some rough idea of what a face is and what it looks like. And on the left here, you can see what a mother's face does look to a newborn infant with its still developing visual system. This is an impoverished image, a lot like the Mooney face we were looking at earlier. So you can see how it would be helpful and advantageous for a newborn infant to have some holistic face processing ability, to have some innate model of a face. I'm suggesting that they have more than that. I'm suggesting that in higher level association cortex that will ultimately be involved in adult social behavior, that a newborn infant has this innate expectation of the existence of its mother, its first and most important social relationship. And that's part one of the hypothesis. Part two is that the circuitry that implements this innate model of the mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. Now, why it would persist into adulthood is an interesting question, and in a few minutes I'll give you one possible answer to that. But right now I'd like to move on to part three of the hypothesis, which is that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the illusory feeling of a loving presence, especially, though not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. And these feelings are often given a religious interpretation because a crude mother-shaped vacuum can easily be misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. This idea is consistent with what we know about the newborns and hatchlings of many, many vertebrate species. Having some kind of innate knowledge is the rule, not the exception. A good example are the herring gull chicks studied by ethologist Nico Tinbergen. They have an innate visual model of their parents' head and bill, especially this prominent red spot near the tip. The chicks will peck at that spot to solicit feeding from the parent, and newly hatched chicks will do that without any prior experience or learning. Tinbergen also discovered that the chicks would peck at artificial models of the bill, and if he made models that exaggerated thinness, redness, and contrast near the tip, he could make a stimulus that was even more effective than the natural one at eliciting this pecking behavior. This is the classic example of what ethologists call a supernormal stimulus, even more effective than the natural one. In much the same way, I'm suggesting that God is a supernormal stimulus to an infant's innate model of the mother. God is a kind of superparent who answers prayers, is perfectly loving, is omnipotent, and omniscient. And these exaggerated attributes excite that innate model even more, even better than a real mother does. And when it's excited, the innate feeling or sense of the mother's existence, the innate certainty of the mother's existence, feeds the certainty of God's existence and the illusion of her or his or her sensed presence. Now, another useful metaphor here comes from the phantom limb of the amputee. The phantom limb happens because the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And the patient's conscious knowledge that this is an illusion doesn't make it go away. I like to combine these two metaphors in this one catchy phrase. In the light of biology, the God of unconditional love is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. God is a supernormal stimulus in the ethological sense to the innate model of the mother, and God's presence is a phantom sensation in the neurological sense because the innate model expects a primordial savior to be there, just like the brain of the amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And this similarity between the phantom limb and the sensed presence is more than just a metaphor. Both the phantom limb and the sensed presence are illusions of embodiment, one's own in the case of the phantom limb and someone else's in the case of the sensed presence. And there's an interesting part of the brain called the temporoparietal junction that appears to be involved in both of these illusions. And it's one of those high-level association areas of the cortex where I think the innate model of the mother is likely to be implemented, although it's not the whole thing. If you stimulate this part of the brain with an electrode, with a direct electrical current, which is something that neurosurgeons sometimes do in preparation for surgery, you can sometimes elicit the illusion of a sensed presence in the patient. Although usually without the religious feelings, that the spatial and the personal aspects of the illusion are there, but the divine love, the powerful emotions, that stuff seems to be missing. But there's another part of the brain where we might find that. This is the orbitofrontal cortex. It's shown in red here. It's on the underside of the frontal lobes, just above the eye sockets. I think this is another area of the brain that's likely to be an essential part of the innate model of the mother. Here it is in a view of the brain from underneath. What's most interesting about it, of course, is what it does. We know from experiments with monkeys that the orbitofrontal cortex is very important for reinforcement learning. A neuron in this part of the brain will learn to become excited by a previously neutral stimulus, like a green triangle projected on a computer screen, but only if it is presented simultaneously with a tasty treat, a nice fruit juice reward or something like that. The tasty treat is called a primary reinforcer because it is innately rewarding. And the green triangle becomes a secondary reinforcer only with learning. So that's the essence of reinforcement learning. And I want to point out that this appears to be yet another example where a specialized kind of learning requires a foundation of innate knowledge, the innate knowledge that orange juice tastes good. Now we know from other experiments, like neuroimaging experiments, that the orbitofrontal cortex is specifically activated when a parent responds to seeing its infant. And we know from other similar experiments that the orbitofrontal cortex is specifically activated when an infant is responding to its mother. So this last finding here, excuse me just a second, this hit the wrong button. This last part here is the thing that's most relevant to my hypothesis. This is what I would expect to find if this part of the brain is implementing part of this innate model of the mother. But it's especially interesting that it's in a part of the brain that does all of these things. I think we can draw some interesting conclusions from this. And the conclusion I would draw is that the innate model of the mother, or at least the part of it that's in this part of the brain, can be thought of as the set of primary reinforcers for learning human social behavior. And if that's right, that could explain why this innate model of the mother persists into adulthood. It would persist because some of it is necessary for learning to be a social animal. And things like the sound of a friendly voice, the smile, the warmth of a person's smiling face, warm, gentle touch, all of those things are innately satisfying and attractive and appealing, and we need to know those things to be able to learn to be a social animal. For example, later in life in courtship and in just plain old everyday social interactions. And there's an astonishing piece of evidence for this. The most compelling piece of evidence from this comes from people who have damage to this part of the brain. They get a syndrome called acquired sociopathy, a truly profound deficit in behavior if this orbitofrontal cortex is damaged. Now, these patients have completely normal cognitive abilities. Their language, memory, mathematical ability, reasoning ability, all of that stuff is intact. But they can't feel the emotional consequences of reward and punishment. They have no gut feelings. And they lack the ability to anticipate the consequences of their actions on other people. So they are also completely devoid of empathy. And these deficits cause them to make terrible decisions, although not usually rising to the level of criminality. But they will do terrible, their work performance will deteriorate, they'll lose their jobs, they'll make stupid investments, they'll go bankrupt, they get divorced, they marry prostitutes. In short, their lives fall apart. But interestingly, the same thing happens if the damage occurs in early infancy. And in fact, the symptoms are most severe if the damage occurs in early infancy. These children in school are disruptive and impulsive. They're always getting in trouble for pathological lying, aggression, stealing. They practice poor hygiene and have bizarre diets. This paper I'm citing here mentioned one patient who liked to eat frozen fish sticks straight out of the freezer without thawing or cooking. And they practice careless sex starting in their early teen years, and they make dangerously negligent parents. All of this suggests that the orbitofrontal cortex is an extremely brittle, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute. We have seen this movie before. This is the same kind of thing we saw earlier in the fusiform face area. And like the fusiform face area, this thing is a learning machine. There's a lot of synaptic plasticity going on here. It's the highly specialized reinforcement learning that requires the foundation of innate knowledge, the knowledge of the primary reinforcers. So all of this is fascinating, and I think it says a lot about my innate model of the mother idea. But does the orbitofrontal cortex have anything to do with the feeling of God's presence? It should, if my hypothesis is right. If the infant's feeling of longing for its mother and the adult spiritual longing for God are just two different manifestations of the same thing, which is basically what my hypothesis says, then we would expect that the part of the brain that implements that should have similar activity in the two conditions. Unfortunately, that's a very hard experiment to do, because what you would most like to do is put someone in a brain scanner who's having that sudden, transient kind of feeling of God's presence and compare their brain activity in that condition to some control condition where they're not having that. But the feeling of God's presence is just very hard to summon on demand. But if there's anybody who could do that, or who could come close to doing it, it would be these people, the Carmelite nuns of Montreal, who spend most of their time seeking closeness to God. This image comes from their website, and it had the caption, "God lives, I stand in his presence." Well, Montreal has not only nuns, but also some neuroscientists, and two of them somehow managed to talk 15 Carmelite nuns into being subjects in an fMRI experiment in which their brain activity during a mystical state was compared to a baseline condition where they were just resting with their eyes closed. Now, in the mystical state, the subjects were asked to remember and relive, with their eyes closed, the most intense mystical experience ever felt in their lives as a member of the Carmelite order. And here's a direct quote from the paper. During the qualitative interviews conducted at the end of the experiment, several subjects mentioned that during the mystical condition they felt the presence of God, his unconditional and infinite love, as well as plenitude and peace. So that's pretty good. That's close to what we want. So what happened in the brain during all of this? The paper describes 14 areas that were specifically active in this mystical versus the baseline condition, and I'm only going to show you the top 5. And at the very top, the one that was most active is the orbitofrontal cortex. So that's encouraging. I don't have a specific interpretation of this next one, the middle temporal area. But these last three, the inferior and superior parietal lobules, those are all in or near the temporoparietal junction. That's the other part of the brain I mentioned earlier, where if you stimulate with electrical current, you can sometimes elicit the feeling of a sensed presence. So all of this is very interesting and suggestive, but it's really only that. It doesn't prove my hypothesis, but it at least is consistent with it. So it's time again for another summary of main points. Religion is partly a biological thing. There's a neonatal root of religion that science has largely overlooked. God's presence is an illusion in high-order association cortex that retains an innate model of mother. In the light of ethology and neuroscience, God is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. And the hypothesis of the innate model of the mother leads to testable predictions, and we saw a little evidence of that in the orbitofrontal cortex. Now I'd like to return to the puzzle that I posed and that Neil deGrasse Tyson referred to at the beginning, which is, why do some of our most brilliant scientists believe in a personal God who answers prayers? I think Francis Collins does not believe in God because he needs more scientific training. I think he believes because he has experienced a cognitively impenetrable illusion, the illusion of God's presence. That, I think, is what's propping up Neil deGrasse Tyson's non-zero asymptote. And it's more than just cognitive impenetrability. The illusion of God's presence is seductive to an empirically trained mind because it feels like evidence. It isn't, it's not evidence, but it feels like evidence. And that's because it comes with this intuitive feeling of knowing as part of the experience. Also, this infantile or neonatal kind of religiousness seems divorced from the social root of religion, which, from certain aspects of the social root of religion that are anathema to a scientific worldview. Things like dogmatism, argument from authority, and truth by revelation. These aspects of religion are repulsive to a scientist. But that's not such a problem if you're only being seduced by the other side of religion that doesn't have this stuff. So here's my answer to Neil's challenge. This asymptote, non-zero asymptote, comes from the neonatal root of religion and the illusion of God's presence. And I have some specific predictions that I can make about this mysterious group of 7% of National Academy of Science members who believe in a God who answers prayer. If my hypothesis is right, these 93% of their colleagues who do not believe in God, compared to them, relative to them, this puzzling 7% should be highly enriched in women, physicians, and other people who score high on psychometric tests of empathy and nurturance. And I have another prediction, and that is that relative to this group over here, the general public who do believe in God, this group should be relatively enriched in people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to explain how these four predictions fall out of my central hypothesis, but that's in the book, along with some other predictions and some other questions raised. For now, I would just like to close by considering one very broad, very important final question. So what? Why does any of this matter? Does it really matter that Francis Collins believes in God? After all, he's probably just about the least likely person in the world to become radicalized and recruited as a suicide bomber. But even so, I would say, yes, it matters, because the religiousness of elite scientists reveals the most irresistible essence of religion's powerful grip on the human mind. That essence is the illusion of God's presence and the neonatal root of religion. It's the mysterious something else going on that nobody seems to be talking about, that science has mostly overlooked. And I think it matters because we have some serious problems on our little planet, and we've been mostly overlooking those too. As a species, we can no longer afford the luxury of magical thinking. The worst thing about religion, I think, is not terrorism, but the way it distracts us from the real problems we face, things like overpopulation, global warming, resource depletion, and mass extinction. That's why we need to understand where religion really comes from. So you can learn more about this at my website, watheyresearch.com, and of course in my book, The Illusion of God's Presence. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, I think you were first in the back there. Yes?
Eventually the mothers, or at least some mothers, stop responding to crying. And how does that fit in with your hypothesis?
Well, the question was, some mothers eventually stop responding to crying. So how does that fit in with my hypothesis? That raises a very, very important dimension of this that I haven't been able to go into at all. I have a whole chapter on that subject, really. And that has to do with the learned aspects of an infant's model of its mother. Most of what an infant or a child comes to learn about their parents obviously does come from learning. It's not innate. The innate stuff is just to get it off the ground, just to get it started. Some parents are negligent, some are even abusive, and this does profoundly affect the way an infant or a child sees its parent. And you would expect, if this idea is right, that this model of the mother is having something to do with religion later on, you would expect that these aspects of parental behavior would also have effects on how people become religious. There's a whole body of literature on that called the attachment theory of religion. The short answer is, you're right, it is important, and it does affect how people become religious. It's just not what I've talked about here yet. Yes?
Yeah, what about the formation of the superego and the probability that most people believe in a male God, deity presence?
Great question. That's one of the first questions that usually comes up when I present this. The question was, why, if this idea is right, if I'm right about the illusion of God's presence coming from an innate model of the mother, then why is God not female? Why do most people seem to think of God as male? And I would say, I have several things to say about that. One is that the maleness of God, I think, comes mostly from what I call the social root of religion. That's where you have a God that is judgmental, that rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. That's my main answer to that. But if I'm right, that there's something innate about this model of the mother, and if it affects religion the way I say it does, then you would expect, even in religions like that, even in religions that are very patriarchal and have a male God and believe in this judgmental, punishing God, you would expect some aspect of the femininity of God to keep cropping up. And in Catholicism, it certainly does. Mary, the Virgin Mary, to Catholics is, in everything but name, a female goddess. And Catholics pray to her as Mother of God, which is just one tiny preposition away from Mother God. And I think that's how they see her. And there are many, of course, world religions that have female gods. We're in this part of the world, we're accustomed to the male God. But that's my answer. It's mainly from the social root, but it creeps into these patriarchal religions also.
But don't you think that the brain may encounter further development past the infancy stages, which orients it towards the male?
The question is, doesn't the brain of an infant encounter more development that might change its orientation more towards the male, or could? And the answer is yes. And of course, fathers are very important in a child's life, just as mothers are. And some of the experience of a child with its father will also shape its image of God. So I agree with that, yes. Yes?
Is there anything to be gained out of the out-of-body experiences that some people have?
The question is there anything to be learned or gained from out-of-body experiences that people have? I've mentioned that a little bit in the book where I'm talking about immortality and what neuroscience has to say about life after death. I'm not sure if that gets at your question, but out-of-body experiences, I think, also are an illusion. I'm not really sure how relevant it is exactly to this innate model of mother thing, but I would just say that when people say they're having a near-death experience, they're actually not near death at all. I could be persuaded of an out-of-body experience being real if it were documented with really robust, irrefutable evidence, like someone floats up to the room and can read a 6-digit number that's hanging from the ceiling.
Right.
People have tried to do that, and they've never had a positive result from that kind of
I
experiment.
understand there have been some laboratory experiences where they've been able to induce the feeling that you could see from behind your head.
Oh, yes, that's right. Excellent question. The comment was that in some laboratory experiments, you can induce an out-of-body experience by sensory tricks. You can put video goggles on a person and show them their own body seen from behind and show them somebody stroking them and give them the feeling of being stroked. So yes, you can induce an illusion that way, yes. Yes?
Not sure exactly how to formulate this question, but I think I understand what you're saying about the relationship with the mother is a first social experience, which then will be expanded and duplicated into adulthood and all that for that individual. To me, religion, I think a big definition of religion is a social experience. You belong to a particular religion because that's the one you're born into that community and like that. My way of asking the question, has anyone ever thought of doing an experiment with identical twins, and one of them is brought up with a bunch of very religious people, and another one is brought up in a very scientific community, very rational, very atheist, and then my question goes to people who believe in God for the reasons you stated, but aren't the simple fact of being born into a society where it's a regular thing also a super important factor?
Right. So the question has to do with the effects of indoctrination and upbringing in a religious culture. And the question specifically was, are there experiments done with twins in which twins are separated at birth and one is raised in a religious environment and another is raised in a non-religious environment? That specific thing I don't think has been done, but there's something very similar to that, and that is the study of twins who were separated at birth. There has been a lot of research on that, and those data have been examined specifically for the question of religiousness. And you find that even that you still find evidence for the genetic effect of religiousness, even in those cases. But you're quite right that indoctrination and the social environment you're brought up in have a profound effect on your religiousness. And the single best predictor of which religion you follow as an adult is, of course, the one your parents had. So that says a lot. Yes?
I've seen film clips of experiments in which people put a helmet on and they induce a strong magnetic field in the brain. And these people say they have a feeling of the presence of God or a mystical experience. Would you comment on that?
Oh, great question. The question was, what about experiments where people are stimulated with magnetic fields around their head and claim as a result of this stimulation to feel the presence of God. That work is done by Michael Persinger in Canada. It's a very interesting, intriguing work, but I'm very skeptical of it. And the reason I'm skeptical is that a group in Sweden tried to reproduce his results and couldn't. They collaborated with him, they used the same kind of equipment, they followed his protocol, and they could not find a correlation between the presence of the magnetic fields and this illusion of a sense presence. So
The Swedes have thicker skulls.
the Swedes have thicker skulls. Could be. I don't know if they measured that. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Just a second. This guy's desperate. Yes.
All the examples that you use to verify your hypothesis are drawn from monotheism.
Okay. And
And multi-plural theism is a much larger population, it's lasted a much longer time.
the comment is that the examples I've used come from monotheism, and polytheism is a tradition that's been around much longer. And actually I do in the book, not in the talk, but in the book I do draw some examples from Hinduism, which are wonderful examples. I think they're very consistent with this idea that in Hinduism you have female goddesses that are very important. And infantilism in religious ritual is a big deal in Hinduism, and they have the equivalent of our baby Jesus in their baby Krishna.
Your example of an infant with a mother image doesn't explain how there can be multiple gods. It only explains how there could be one God.
Well, I don't know. The comment is that my hypothesis doesn't predict multiple gods. It predicts only one God, the one primordial Savior. I don't know how critical that is. I think it's such a vague thing. It's just a sense of the existence of some kind of vague Savior out there upon whom your existence and your life depends. I'm not even sure if it. I don't know. That's an interesting point, but I think if you just have that much, the sense that there is a primordial Savior out there somewhere, that's enough to get you started and get you to feel this presence of a God. And I guess I should point out that in Hinduism, it's often the case that Hindus devote their belief or their faith or whatever. They pick a God, they choose a God, they zero in on one that will be the center of their devotion, even though they believe in all of them. So, I don't know. That's the best I can do. Yes?
Is there any correlation that you know of between the fMRIs that were done on the Canadian nuns and fMRIs that have been done on Buddhist monks when they entered into a meditative state?
Question is there any similarity between the fMRIs done on Buddhist monks with the experiments I described in the nuns? I don't think so. They were done in a very different way. The experiments that were done with the monks were done with a PET scan in which they inject a drug, a radioactive tracer, at the moment when the peak of their meditative state is achieved. And that's a much lower resolution state. And so
There's
they...
also some fMRIs, though, that were done on monks versus those who have been trained in Western meditation.
Oh, yeah.
With pain structures.
Yeah. I really don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. Yes.
You said 3 questions. Give us a break. Well, I mean, you know, there's a lot of people.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay. Psychiatrists use the phrase Oedipus complex.
Yes.
Theoretically, then, the closer the person is to the mother early on, is the higher proclivity for them to be more religious, and vice versa. Have you done any studies on that? Do you know anything about this connection between mother love and religious proclivity?
Oh, the question had to do with Freud's idea about religion coming from the relationship between the infant with a mother and the Oedipus complex. And the Oedipus complex predicts that infants will tend that female infants will tend to be more affectionate to God and have more loving relationship with God, and male infants will tend to be more afraid of God because of the Oedipal thing. I do talk about that in the book. I give Freud a lot of credit for having the insight that there is something infantile about religion. As far as I can tell, he was the first who really came out with that idea. There is a problem with the Oedipal complex, though. The main reason Freud came up with that idea was not to say anything about religion, although he used it when he talked about religion. He was mainly getting at where the incest taboo comes from. That's what that is really about. And the Oedipal idea makes testable predictions about incest. It predicts that if, for example, brothers and sisters are, if they're separated, if they live in a, anyway, I don't know if I can go into the full explanation. It takes a long time. The essence of it is, though, that the competing hypothesis is one that incest is not something, the incest taboo is not something that's tacked on to human culture to keep brothers and sisters from having sex with one another, or children and parents from having sex with one another, but rather the aversion to incest is innate, that we are biologically averse to it, and the incest taboo is something that society has tacked on to that. So those are the two alternative views, and the evidence strongly supports the innate aversion to incest and does not support Freud's idea.
Jack, let's do two more questions.
Okay.
Up here, please.
Yes.
Yes. Religious illusioning, the conclusion of religious illusioning as being inheritable, is it just simply because it's a biological thing, or could you expand on that?
If I understand the question correctly, you're asking me to expand on the idea of religion being a biological thing.
So rude. You have been rude since you've been sitting there.
I guess I would make the comment that when I say that religion is a biological thing, I emphasize the word partly. It's partly a biological thing, it's partly an environmental thing, and it's not destiny that any of us will become religious because of this. The bad news is that 50% of the variance across individuals comes from genetic factors. That's the bad news from those twin studies on religiousness. The good news is that 50% comes from environmental factors. So there is hope. We're not stuck being religious. Yes?
When you look at children that are orphaned at birth, is there a high percentage of atheism among that group?
The question is, if children are orphaned at birth, is there a higher percentage of atheism among that group? That gets to what I was talking about earlier, the attachment theory of religion. There are profound effects of that. So yes, it doesn't so much make people less religious, but it changes the way they come to religion. People who have poor attachment in childhood, and what you've just described is one way that happens, being orphaned. People with attachment disruptions tend to they tend to have religiousness opposite to that of their parents. So if they were raised by religious parents, they'll tend to be not religious. If they were raised by atheists, they'll tend to be religious. And when they become religious, though, it's in this very sudden kind of transformation where they have a sudden experience, a sudden feeling of God's presence or whatever, a sudden conversion.
Okay.
Can I get one more from?
Last question.
So sorry.
First of all, I want to tell you, I appreciate your thoughts on this, and your lecture is wonderful. I have been thinking about these issues as a climate ecologist for many years, and a biologist, and I agree with you that it is genetic. heritage we have is status-oriented individuals, where we have a hierarchy past, and we're still hierarchical, and perhaps your primary and secondary reinforcements are that we have connected that mother connection to the status of males and the status of a social hierarchy that we have, which has led us to thinking God is the father and obedience, and we have to apply, but mostly also its connection to politics, because religion has always been a conduit of political control, and we see that constantly, even to today. And I'm wondering whether what you're proposing, we're able to connect, because religion is always seems to be susceptible to politics. We have the religious right continuously in the history of humankind, where religion and power very much in connection with each other, and I think it's because religion is something that's happened to people, and if you tag it on to politics, the right wing, for example, then it becomes one, because one unified thing. I guess that's enough for those.
Well, that's a great comment, and
You almost missed on that, but I'm calling you.
I'm so sorry. Yes, the comment had to do. The last part of the comment had to do with the role of religion in politics, and how political behavior, rallying around your tribe, your political tribe, is intimately tied up with religion. And I have a chapter devoted to that, and if you go to my website and look on my blog, you can see several posts I've written there about that subject having to do with our new president. Yes, he has narcissistic personality disorder, in my humble opinion, which is a fascinating syndrome, and I think that there's a high genetic component to that.
Let's end it on that note.